For the Gospels to be legendary in their core, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to be, and I quote, unbelievable. More generations would be needed. Secondly, the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or contemporary urban legends. Tales like those about Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill, or contemporary urban legends about the vanishing hitchhiker, rarely concern actual historical individuals, and therefore are not analogous to the gospel narratives. The gospel accounts are about real people that actually lived and that you can read about in literature contemporaneous with the New Testament, about real events that actually took place, about real places that have been archaeologically excavated, and thus they are not analogous to folk tales or urban legends. 3, the Jewish transmission of sacred traditions was highly developed and reliable. In an oral culture, like that of first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and to retain large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. From the earliest age, children in the home, in the elementary school, and in the synagogue were taught to memorize faithfully sacred tradition. The disciples would have exercised similar care with the teachings of Jesus, and thus to compare the gospel narratives, as some have done, with the child's game of telephone displays a complete misunderstanding of how oral tradition works in an oral culture like first century Jewish society. 4, there were significant restraints on the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, such as the presence of eyewitnesses and the apostles' supervision. Since those who had seen and heard Jesus continued to live, and the tradition about Jesus remained under the supervision of the apostles, these factors would act as a natural check upon any tendencies to elaborate the facts in a direction contrary to that preserved by those who had known Jesus and were entrusted with the tradition. And finally, number 5, the gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability. I have time to only look at one example of this, Luke. Luke was the author of a 2-part work, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. These are really one work, and they are separated in our Bible simply because the church grouped together the 4 Gospels in assembling the New Testament. Luke is the gospel writer who writes most self-consciously as a historian. In the preface to his work, he writes as follows in his dedication to Theophilus. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. This preface to Luke's double work was written in classical Greek, such as was used by Greek historians. After this, Luke changes to a more common Greek. But he's put his reader on alert that he can write, should he wish to, like the learned Greek historian. He speaks in his preface of his lengthy investigation into the story he's about to tell. He assures us that it is based on eyewitness information and is accordingly the truth. Now, who was this author that we call Luke? He was clearly not himself an eyewitness to Jesus' life, but we discover an important fact about him from the book of Acts. Beginning in the 16th chapter of Acts, when Paul reaches Troas in modern-day Turkey, the author suddenly starts using the first person plural. We set sail from Troas to Samothrace. We remained in Philippi for some days as we were going to the place of prayer and so forth. The most obvious explanation is that the author had joined Paul's entourage on his evangelistic tour of the Mediterranean cities. In chapter 21, he accompanies Paul back to Palestine and finally to Jerusalem. What this means is that the author of Luke Acts was in fact in first-hand contact with eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry in Jerusalem. Skeptical critics have done backflips to try to avoid this conclusion. They've said, for example, that the use of the first person plural in the book of Acts shouldn't be taken literally. It's just a literary device which was common in ancient sea voyage stories. Well, never mind that many of the passages in the book of Acts are not about Paul's sea voyage, but take place on land. The more important point is that when you check it out, this theory turns out to be sheer fantasy. There just is no literary device in the ancient world of sea voyages told in the first person plural. The whole thing has been shown to be a scholarly fiction. There is no avoiding the conclusion that Luke Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul who had the opportunity to interview eyewitnesses to Jesus' life while in Jerusalem. Who were some of these eyewitnesses? Perhaps we can get some clue by subtracting from the Gospel of Luke everything found in the other Gospels and seeing what remains that is peculiar to Luke alone. When you do this, what you discover is that many of Luke's peculiar narratives are connected to women who followed Jesus. People like Joanna and Susanna, and significantly, Mary, Jesus' mother. Was the author reliable in getting his facts straight? The book of Acts enables us to answer that question decisively. You see, the book of Acts overlaps significantly with the secular history of the ancient world, and the historical accuracy of Acts is indisputable. This has recently been demonstrated anew by Colin Heemer, a classical scholar who turned to New Testament studies in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Heemer goes through the book of Acts with a fine-toothed comb, pulling out a wealth of historical detail, ranging from what would have been common knowledge at that time down to details which only a local person would have known. Again and again and again, Luke's accuracy is demonstrated. From the sailings of the Alexandrian corn fleet out of Egypt to the coastal terrain of the Mediterranean islands to the peculiar titles of the local officials, which were shifting constantly, Luke gets it right. According to Professor Sherwin White, and I quote, "The confirmation of historicity in Acts is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd." End quote. The judgment of Sir William Ramsay, a world-famous archaeologist, still stands. He said, "Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed among the very greatest of historians." Given Luke's care and demonstrated reliability, as well as his contact with eyewitnesses within the first generation after the events, this author is trustworthy. So, on the basis of those 5 reasons that I listed, I personally think that we should assume that the Gospels are historically reliable in what they have to say about Jesus, unless they are proven to be mistaken. But in any case, at the very least, we cannot assume that they are wrong unless they are proven To be right, we should at least adopt a position of neutrality in approaching the gospel accounts. Now, by the very nature of the case, it will be impossible to say a whole lot more beyond this point to prove that certain stories in the Gospels are historically true. How could you prove, for example, the story of Jesus visiting Mary and Martha in Bethany? You just have here a story told by a reliable author in a position to know and no good reason to doubt the historicity of the story. There's not a whole lot more to be said. Nevertheless, for many of the key events of the Gospels, a great deal more can be said. And what I'd like to do now is to take some of the most important facets of Jesus in the Gospel and say a brief word about their historical credibility. Number one, then, Jesus' radical self-concept as the unique Son of God. Radical critics deny that the historical Jesus thought of himself as the divine Son of God. They say that after Jesus' death, the early church claimed that he had said such things, even though he really hadn't. Now, the fundamental problem facing this hypothesis is that it is inexplicable how monotheistic Jews could have attributed to divinity to a man whom they had accompanied during his lifetime if he had never claimed any such things himself. Monotheism is the very heart of the Jewish religion, and it would have been blasphemous to say that a human being was God. And yet this is precisely what the earliest Christians did believe and proclaim about Jesus. Such a claim must have been rooted in Jesus' own self-understanding and teaching. And in fact, the majority of scholars do believe that among the historically authentic words of Jesus are claims that reveal his divine self-understanding. Now, I could give a whole lecture on this point alone, but let me just focus on Jesus' self-concept of being the unique Son of God. Jesus' radical self-understanding as God's only Son is revealed, for example, in his parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard in Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Even skeptical scholars admit the authenticity of this parable, that it was actually spoken by the historical Jesus. Now, in this parable, the owner of the vineyard sends servants to the tenants of the vineyard to collect its fruit. The vineyard symbolizes Israel. The owner is God. The tenants are the Jewish religious leaders, and the servants are the prophets sent by God. The tenants beat and reject the owner's servants. Finally, the owner says, "I have one left to send, my only beloved son. They will listen to my son." But instead, the tenants kill the son because he is the heir of the vineyard. Now, what does this parable tell us about Jesus' self-understanding? It tells us that he thought of himself as God's only Son, distinct from all the prophets who had gone before, God's final messenger, and even the heir of Israel itself. This is no mere Jewish peasant. Jesus' self-concept as God's Son comes to explicit expression in Matthew 11:27. He said, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Now again, there's good reason to think that this is an authentic saying of the historical Jesus. It is drawn from an old source shared by Matthew and Luke, which scholars call the Q document. Moreover, it's unlikely that the church invented this saying because it says that the Son is unknowable. No one knows the Son except the Father. But you see, for the post-Easter church, we can know Christ personally. We do know the Son. So this saying is not a